The world as Jason knew it had ended, but it hadn't happened overnight. It started small, a story here, a rumor there, whispers of strange illnesses spreading rapidly across the globe. At first, it was dismissed as an overreaction, a virus that would blow over. But as the news reports grew darker, the truth became undeniable: the dead were rising. The apocalypse wasn't a distant threat, it had already begun. And now, Jason found himself stranded in the heart of it, a lone survivor fighting for his life. Jason had been at work when the chaos erupted. He still remembered the moment the emergency alarms blared, the loudspeaker's frantic announcement that they were to evacuate the building immediately. The panic that spread through the office was infectious, as people rushed to grab their things and flee, unsure of what was happening but sure of one thing: they didn't want to be there when it hit. Jason grabbed his bag and headed out into the streets, hoping the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. But as soon as he stepped outside, he saw the truth for himself. Cars were overturned, fires burned in the distance, and the streets were filled with the sounds of chaos, screams, sirens, and the eerie, guttural growls of something far worse than human. The air felt thick with fear, and Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly realized the severity of what was happening. It wasn't just a virus, it was a war against the undead. The dead were walking among the living. Jason's mind raced. Should he head to the government shelter on the outskirts of the city? He had heard whispers that they were setting up a safe zone there, but he wasn't sure how reliable the information was. Besides, he wasn't even sure how long the roads would be passable. He glanced around and saw a group of people running toward a nearby alley, clearly desperate to escape the madness. Without thinking, he followed them, hoping for any chance to survive. As he ducked into the alley, Jason's instincts kicked in. The streets were no longer safe. There was no time to think about what had happened or why. He had to focus on surviving, and that meant getting as far away from the chaos as possible. He followed the group through narrow back streets, making his way toward what he hoped would be safety. But the world was no longer predictable. Jason's footsteps faltered when he heard a distant, guttural growl, too close. He turned a corner and nearly collided with a figure stumbling into his path. The man's clothes were torn, his skin pale and mottled, his eyes clouded over. Jason's heart stopped for a beat, his breath catching in his throat. The man's mouth hung open in a grotesque snarl, revealing jagged teeth as he lurched forward. Jason barely had time to react. His body moved instinctively, the fear propelling him forward as he ducked into another alley. Behind him, the sound of shuffling feet grew louder, and he knew the undead were closing in. He couldn't outrun them forever. His mind raced. What now? Where could he go? What could he do to survive? His eyes darted around. The alleyway was a dead end. The only option left was the rooftop of a nearby building. He looked up and saw a fire escape ladder hanging down, swaying gently in the wind. Without thinking, Jason bolted for it, gripping the metal bars with sweaty palms as he climbed. Every second felt like an eternity, and his heart thudded in his chest. The sounds of the undead grew louder, their growls and hissing filling the air. He could hear the shuffle of footsteps, but he didn't dare look back. The fire escape was rusty, and Jason cursed under his breath as his foot slipped once. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, willing himself to move faster. Finally, with a final desperate heave, he pulled himself up onto the roof. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He couldn't afford to. Looking around, he spotted another building across the street, the gap between them wide but not impossible to cross. With the undead hot on his heels, he knew he had no choice. Jason sprinted to the edge of the roof, his mind focused solely on the gap ahead. His muscles burned with exhaustion, but there was no turning back. If he didn't make the leap, he would be trapped. He could already hear the growls of the undead climbing up the fire escape. Taking a deep breath, Jason propelled himself forward, his heart in his throat. He landed hard on the other side, his knees buckling beneath him as he rolled across the roof. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He scrambled to his feet, looking for the next escape route. The world had changed in an instant, and Jason knew he couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving. Somewhere in the distance, Jason heard the sounds of more survivors shouting for help, but there was no time to rescue them, not now. He had to think about his own survival. He kept moving, his only focus on escaping the hell that had taken over his world. The first signs of the undead had shown up just hours ago, and already, everything he knew was gone. If he wanted to survive, he had to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than ever before. The fight for freedom had begun. Jason's heart hammered in his chest as he sprinted across the rooftops, jumping from one building to the next with little regard for the pain shooting through his body. His mind was locked in survival mode, driven by one primal instinct: escape. The undead were relentless, but so was he. He had already made it this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. As he leapt over another gap between buildings, Jason's foot slipped just before landing, and he barely managed to catch himself on the edge. His fingers scraped against the rough surface of the wall, and for a moment, it felt like the ground below him was pulling him into its grip. Panic surged, but he forced himself to breathe deeply. He had come too far to fall now. With a final push, Jason hoisted himself up, his body aching, but his resolve unshaken. He looked around for his next move. The buildings stretched out in all directions, a maze of concrete and steel. From his vantage point, he could see the distant skyline, darkened by plumes of smoke rising from the heart of the city. It was a sign of the chaos that had consumed everything. Civilization had crumbled, and there was no turning back. His eyes scanned the area, searching for a way out, when a strange sound caught his attention. It wasn't the shuffle of the undead, it was something different: human voices, muffled by the distance, but unmistakable. Jason froze, his heart pounding. Was it a group of survivors? Or was it another trap set by the undead? Without thinking, he cautiously made his way to the edge of the roof and peered down, his eyes narrowing as he searched the streets below. He could see a small group of people moving quickly through an alleyway, trying to avoid the chaos unfolding in the streets. They appeared to be armed, carrying makeshift weapons, crowbars, pipes, and even a broken chair leg. Jason's mind raced. He couldn't stay up here forever. If there were survivors down there, there was a chance he could join them. But would they be trustworthy? In a world like this, trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal could come at any moment. His decision was made for him when a loud crash echoed from below, followed by an unholy screech. The undead had found the group. Jason's pulse quickened as he watched in horror. The survivors were fighting for their lives, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The undead were closing in on them, their grotesque forms lurching forward with hunger in their eyes. Jason's heart wrenched as he saw a woman fall, her screams echoing through the alley. She was dragged into the horde, her body vanishing in an instant. Without thinking, Jason leapt from the roof, landing in the alley with a hard thud. He barely managed to roll with the impact before springing to his feet. He could hear the growls growing louder as the undead turned their attention toward him. There was no time to waste. Jason grabbed a rusty pipe from the ground and swung it with all his might, knocking the nearest undead back. It wasn't enough to stop them, but it bought him a few precious seconds. "Hey! Over here!" Jason shouted to the survivors, hoping they would hear him above the chaos. One of the survivors, a man in his 30s, tall and stocky, turned to look at him. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, but he didn't hesitate. "Get to the alley. Now!" Jason wasted no time. He sprinted toward the group, using the pipe to fend off any undead that got too close. The woman who had been attacked earlier was gone, but there were still a few survivors left. They were moving with purpose, retreating down the alley toward an abandoned building at the end. Jason followed them without a second thought. They made it inside just as the undead reached the alley. The door slammed shut behind them, and they all collapsed to the floor, panting and covered in sweat. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps, his body still shaking from the adrenaline. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice hoarse. "Jason," he replied, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. I saw you guys back there. I couldn't just leave you." The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'm Alex. This is Sarah and Mark," he said, gesturing to the two other survivors. Sarah was a younger woman, probably in her 20s, with long, disheveled hair, and Mark was older, with a graying beard and weary eyes. Jason didn't have time to ask about their story. The undead were still out there, and the building wasn't safe for long. "We need to keep moving," he said urgently. "They'll find us if we stay here." Alex didn't argue. "Agreed. We have a plan." We head west to the old military base. It's one of the few places that hasn't been overrun. Jason's eyes narrowed. A military base sounded like the best shot at survival, but it was also a long journey. The undead had overrun the cities, and the countryside wasn't much safer. They would need supplies, weapons, and a solid plan. But for now, it was their best hope. "I'll follow you," Jason said, his voice steady. "But we need to keep moving. We can't waste any time." With a grim nod, Alex led the way, and the group moved cautiously through the dark, abandoned building. Outside, the world was a nightmare. But for the first time since the outbreak, Jason felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had found a group that could help him escape the undead and survive. The real fight for freedom had just begun. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light over the ruins of the city. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the distant moans and growls that echoed from the depths of the decimated city. Jason had joined Alex, Sarah, and Mark without hesitation. It felt strange, walking alongside others after so long alone, but in a world overrun by the undead, camaraderie was now a luxury he couldn't afford to take for granted. They moved carefully through the city, using alleys and back streets to avoid the main roads. Every corner could be hiding another horde, and every shadow seemed to whisper danger. Jason's senses were on high alert. His every step was measured, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, ever watchful for movement. Alex led the way, his grip tight on a baseball bat. Mark carried a rifle, its barrel gleaming in the dim light, while Sarah kept to the rear, her eyes darting back and forth. Jason took a spot in the middle of the group, his instincts guiding him. They had no map, only a vague sense of direction. Their goal, the military base to the west, a place Alex insisted was the last known sanctuary for survivors. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. "You sure about this?" Jason asked, his voice low as they crouched behind a burned-out vehicle. He glanced around, his hand resting on the handle of a crowbar he had scavenged earlier. Alex nodded grimly. "It's the only place left with a chance of surviving. The government set up a defense perimeter there. They've got food, weapons, and most importantly, a stronghold. We need to get there before it's overrun, too." "Any word on how it's holding up?" Jason asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. "No," Alex answered quietly, his gaze hardening. "But it's better than waiting to die here." Mark checked his rifle, nodding in agreement. Sarah, however, remained silent, her face pale and distant. Jason could see the weight of everything pressing down on her, and he knew they were all carrying the same burden of uncertainty. The world had changed in a heartbeat, and now, they were just a handful of survivors stumbling through a wasteland, hoping against hope that they could reach safety. They pressed on, keeping their pace steady. Every now and then, they had to crouch low or slip into buildings to avoid encounters with the undead. It was nerve-wracking. The air seemed thick with tension, and the constant fear of being surrounded weighed heavily on them. Jason's muscles ached from the effort, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. They reached the outskirts of the city by midday, where the familiar sounds of the city faded, replaced by the unsettling silence of the countryside. The road ahead seemed almost peaceful, too peaceful. It was a false sense of security that Jason didn't trust. He could feel the weight of the silence, the way it hung heavy in the air. They weren't out of danger yet. "We need to rest for a bit," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she paused, sweat glistening on her forehead. Alex shot her a look, but Jason could see the exhaustion in his eyes too. "We can't. Not here. The moment we stop, we're easy targets." "But we're not going to make it if we don't rest," Mark said, his voice rough. We can't just keep pushing. Jason considered this. They had been moving for hours, with little more than scraps of food and water. Their chances of survival were slim if they didn't regroup soon. But at the same time, they couldn't afford to stay exposed for too long. The undead were relentless, and the more they lingered, the more likely they were to be caught. We can make it to that old farmhouse, Jason suggested, his eyes scanning the horizon. It's about half a mile down the road. We'll rest there and keep watch. Alex hesitated but then nodded. Fine. We'll go to the farmhouse. But we stay on high alert. The group continued their trek, moving at a slower pace now, but still keeping an eye on the horizon. The farmhouse appeared in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the overcast sky. Jason's heart quickened. It was a welcome sight, but his mind couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet. When they reached the farmhouse, they found the door ajar. It was a bad sign. This doesn't feel right, Jason murmured, his grip tightening on his crowbar. Keep your guard up, Alex warned. We're not alone. The group moved cautiously into the farmhouse, its wooden floors creaking beneath their feet. The air was stale, and the remnants of a once-lived-in home were scattered across the floor, broken furniture, overturned lamps, and empty cans. There were no signs of life. Clear, Mark called from the kitchen, motioning for the others to follow. Jason felt a brief sense of relief. They were safe, for now. The farmhouse was defensible, with windows to keep watch and a locked door. It was a temporary haven, but it would do. They could rest, eat, and plan the next leg of their journey. As they settled in, Sarah started rifling through the cupboards, looking for food. Jason sat by the window, watching the horizon, but his mind kept drifting back to the moment they'd entered the farmhouse. Something didn't sit right with him. Suddenly, there was a loud noise outside, something heavy crashing to the ground. Jason's heart leaped into his throat as he stood up. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew one thing: it wasn't good. Get to the back. Alex barked, drawing his bat. The undead were close. Their brief respite was over. The real fight for survival had begun. The noise outside grew louder, thumps and growls that set Jason's nerves on edge. His heart raced as he quickly scanned the room, his mind running through every possible scenario. The farmhouse was defensible, but it wasn't impenetrable. They would need to act fast. Get to the back door. Alex shouted, his voice urgent. Mark, Sarah, barricade the windows. Jason, help me with the door. Jason didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby chair and shoved it against the farmhouse's back door, wedging it between the frame and the wall. Alex moved quickly to the front door, sliding a table in front of it. The sound of shuffling feet outside made Jason's blood run cold. They were getting closer. Where are they coming from? Jason asked, his voice tight with fear. There are too many to count, Alex replied, his eyes sharp. They're probably drawn by the noise, the movement. We just need to hold out long enough to figure out a way out. Jason moved to the window, peering out through the cracked blinds. His heart skipped a beat when he saw them, a horde of undead, shambling across the field toward the farmhouse. They were slow, but relentless, and there were dozens of them. We don't have much time, Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to move fast. Agreed, Mark said, glancing nervously out the kitchen window. But we need to fight. If we leave now, we'll be sitting ducks. We can't outrun this many. Jason knew Mark was right. They couldn't just run, the undead were too close. They needed to fight, to hold their ground. But how? They had no weapons, no ammunition, just what they'd scavenged from the city. He looked at the others, their faces grim and determined, and knew they were all thinking the same thing: survival was going to require more than just luck. We make our stand here, Alex said firmly, gripping his baseball bat tightly. We fight. If we can hold them off long enough, we make it to the barn out back. There's a truck there. If it still runs, we can get the hell out of here. Jason nodded. What's the plan? Keep them at bay, Alex replied. We'll use the windows to our advantage. Mark, you take the kitchen. Sarah, you watch the front. Jason, you're with me. We'll take the back. They quickly took their positions, setting up a makeshift defense. The farmhouse was small, with narrow windows and only a few rooms. The undead were almost at the door, and Jason could feel the sweat beading on his forehead. He gripped his crowbar tightly, taking a deep breath. On my count, Alex said, his voice steady. 3, 2, 1. The front door burst open with a loud crash, and the undead flooded in. The stench of death hit Jason like a wave, and his stomach churned. But there was no time to hesitate. He swung the crowbar with all his might, knocking one of the zombies back. It staggered, but another one took its place, its pale eyes locked onto him as it lurched forward. Jason swung again, the metal of the crowbar connecting with the zombie's skull with a sickening thud. It crumpled to the floor, but more kept coming, each one more relentless than the last. Push them back. Alex shouted from the back. We need to get to the barn. Jason didn't need any more encouragement. He stepped forward, using the crowbar to batter down the undead that got too close. His heart raced as he looked to his left, seeing Sarah and Mark doing the same, fighting for their lives, using everything they had to survive. The barn was only a few hundred yards away, but the undead were closing in fast. They couldn't hold the farmhouse forever. Jason's muscles burned as he swung again and again, knocking down zombies and creating a small path toward the back door. It felt like hours, though it had only been minutes. The relentless onslaught of the undead seemed never-ending. Finally, Alex grabbed Jason's arm, pulling him toward the back. Let's go. Jason didn't hesitate. He followed Alex out the back door, his legs almost giving out from exhaustion. The barn was in sight, but the field between them and their escape was crawling with zombies. They had to make it. There was no other choice. Run! Alex shouted. They sprinted across the field, weaving through the undead, who moaned and reached out with gnashing teeth. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not now. They were so close. A zombie lunged at him, and Jason barely managed to dodge, feeling the cold fingers of the undead brush against his shoulder. He twisted his body, using the crowbar to knock the creature off balance. It stumbled but didn't fall. Jason's heart raced as he shoved it aside, continuing toward the barn. He could see the truck now, its rusted body sitting in the distance like a lifeline. Behind him, Alex was already at the barn door, kicking it open. Mark and Sarah were close behind, their faces filled with desperation. Move! Move! Alex shouted as he climbed into the truck's driver's seat. Jason reached the barn, the sound of the undead growing louder behind him. His chest felt like it was on fire, but he didn't stop. He vaulted into the truck bed, turning to help Sarah and Mark climb in. The truck's engine sputtered to life, and for a moment, Jason thought they might be free. But as Alex slammed the truck into gear, a loud crash echoed from the barn door. A zombie had made its way inside, its feral growls filling the air. Jason quickly grabbed the crowbar again, his last line of defense. Go, he shouted. We can't wait. Alex slammed the truck into reverse, and the barn doors splintered open. The truck roared to life, speeding away from the farmhouse, the sound of the undead still ringing in their ears. Jason leaned back against the truck bed, breathless but alive. They had made it out. For now. But the world was still full of the undead, and the road ahead was just as dangerous. Their fight for survival was far from over. The truck's engine rumbled as they sped away from the farmhouse, leaving the chaos and horror behind them. Jason's heart still raced, the adrenaline of the fight slowly ebbing away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The events of the past few hours had been a blur, a desperate scramble for survival, but they were alive. Barely, but alive. The truck bounced along the uneven road, and Jason's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, his mind still on the farmhouse, on the undead that had almost consumed them. The barn was now behind them, but it felt like the nightmare wasn't finished. The world outside the truck windows was a wasteland, dead trees, abandoned vehicles, and scattered remnants of civilization. There was nothing left to remind them of the world that once was. It was just them, and the endless horizon. Sarah sat in the cab next to Alex, her face pale and drawn, her eyes vacant. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the farmhouse. Mark sat beside Jason in the back, his face hard, eyes staring out at the road ahead. The group had grown quiet after the escape, the reality of what they'd just been through settling in. Jason turned to look at him. "You okay?" Mark didn't answer right away. His hands were clenched tightly around the edge of the truck bed, his knuckles white. Finally, he exhaled slowly and nodded, though it was clear that the weight of everything was bearing down on him. "Yeah," Mark said quietly. Just a lot to take in, you know? We almost didn't make it." Jason's gaze drifted back to the road ahead, his mind racing. They hadn't made it out unscathed, and they knew it. The fight at the farmhouse had taken a toll on them, physically and emotionally. But at least they were still moving, still breathing. And as long as that was the case, there was hope. "What now?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. "We keep going," Alex's voice came from the front, steady and firm. "The military base is still our best chance. We've got a few hours before dark. If we push hard, we can make it before nightfall. We can rest there, regroup, and figure out what's next." Jason nodded, but doubt lingered in the back of his mind. The military base was their goal, their beacon of hope in this ruined world. But how much longer would it stand? How much longer would any of the safe places last in a world overrun by the undead? He shook the thought away. He couldn't afford to think like that, not now. They had a chance to survive, and that's all that mattered. As the truck continued down the empty road, Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice soft and hesitant. Do you think we'll really be safe there?" Her question hung in the air, fragile and full of fear. "At the military base, I mean." Jason exchanged a look with Mark. It was a question they had all been thinking, but none of them had wanted to ask. The truth was, no one knew. The undead were everywhere, and the world they had known was gone. The military base might be their best shot, but there were no guarantees. Alex spoke up, his voice unwavering. "We have to believe we'll be safe. We have to believe there's a way out of this. If we don't, then what's the point?" There was a moment of silence before Sarah nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. "Right," she whispered. "We have to believe." The truck rumbled on, the tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The road stretched out endlessly, and Jason couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, no matter how small. They were still moving, still fighting, and that counted for something. As they neared the outskirts of the city, the landscape changed. The decaying urban sprawl gave way to more rural areas, overgrown with weeds and long-forgotten fields. A place that, in another time, might have been considered peaceful. Now, it was just another stretch of land filled with danger. Jason's mind wandered, lost in thought as he stared out at the endless fields stretching toward the horizon. Could they really make it to the base? What would they find when they got there? Would they find others like them, or would the place already be overrun? There were so many unanswered questions, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Suddenly, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement far ahead on the road. Jason's body tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Alex, slow down," he shouted, pointing toward the distance. Alex's hand immediately went to the wheel, slowing the truck to a crawl as they neared the spot Jason had seen the movement. The others leaned forward, their eyes scanning the horizon. Ahead, a figure appeared, someone stumbling along the road. It was a lone person, dressed in tattered clothes, moving slowly, their face obscured by the shadow of a hood. "Is it one of them?" Sarah whispered, her voice tense with fear. Jason squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't seem to be moving like an undead. There was something human about it. They might have been injured, or perhaps just lost. "Hold on," Jason said, his hand on the door handle. He didn't know why, but something told him they had to stop. Something in his gut told him this might be the help they needed. "Jason, don't," Mark cautioned. "It could be a trap. We don't know who that is." "I have to check," Jason said, his voice firm. "It could be another survivor." With no more time to argue, Jason jumped out of the truck, his feet hitting the ground with a thud. He walked cautiously toward the figure, his grip on the crowbar tight. As he got closer, the figure stopped and turned toward him. It was a woman, her face covered in dirt, her eyes hollow but still alert. She didn't look like one of the undead. "Hey!" Jason called out, his voice steady but loud enough to be heard. "Are you okay?" The woman blinked, her eyes wide as she took a step back, her hands raised in defense. She seemed afraid, but not in the way the undead were. I'm not infected," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need help." Jason hesitated, glancing back at the truck where the others were waiting. He knew the risks of helping a stranger in this world, but he also knew the value of solidarity. They needed allies, and this woman might be one. "Where are you headed?" Jason asked, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury or illness. "Anywhere," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm just trying to survive." Jason nodded slowly. She was like them, just trying to make it, just trying to survive. "Get in," Jason said, motioning toward the truck. "We're headed to a military base. You can come with us." The woman hesitated, looking from Jason to the truck. Finally, after a long pause, she nodded, taking a cautious step forward. "Thank you," she whispered. Jason helped her into the truck, where Sarah, Mark, and Alex exchanged wary glances. There was no telling what the woman's story was, or whether she could be trusted. But for now, she was one more person fighting to survive, and that was enough. As the truck started moving again, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was about to get even more complicated. But he pushed the thought aside. For now, they were together. And for a brief moment, that was all that mattered. The truck rumbled onward, the weight of the unknown settling in with each passing mile. The woman sat quietly in the back, her eyes darting nervously between the group as though waiting for someone to make the first move. Jason could feel the tension in the air, thick and uncomfortable. He kept his eyes focused on the road, trying to push aside the unease gnawing at him. He'd grown wary of strangers in this new world. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. And yet, here they were, offering help to someone they knew nothing about. The truck's tires kicked up dust as they traveled deeper into the rural wasteland. The world around them had become a blur of barren fields, abandoned houses, and the occasional wrecked car, evidence of a life long forgotten. The silence in the truck was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the undead from a distance. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, stalked by something more than just the undead. The weight of survival was heavy on his shoulders, and it only got heavier as they moved farther from safety. "Where did you come from?" Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low but pointed as he glanced at the woman. She seemed startled by the question, but Jason couldn't blame him for asking. After everything they'd been through, trusting a stranger was risky. But in this world, who could afford not to take risks? The woman hesitated, her voice trembling. "I was in the city, up north. My group, we were trying to find somewhere safe. We made it to a shelter, but it was overrun. I don't know what happened to them. I was the only one who made it out." Jason's heart went out to her, but a part of him remained guarded. Everyone had lost someone. The survivors they encountered in this world all shared the same painful stories, but that didn't always mean they could be trusted. "Why didn't you just stay in the city?" Sarah's voice was soft but laced with suspicion. She had been quiet since the woman climbed into the truck, and Jason knew it wasn't just the trauma of the farmhouse attack weighing on her. She didn't trust this stranger. None of them did. The woman's shoulders slumped. "I couldn't stay there. It was too dangerous. Every day, it got worse. The undead were everywhere. I had to leave." Jason caught her gaze in the rearview mirror, trying to read her eyes. There was fear there, but it didn't seem like fear of them. She was scared of something else, something much bigger. "We're headed for the military base," Jason said cautiously, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. "It's our best chance. There may still be survivors there." The woman's eyes widened at the mention of the military base. She was silent for a moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I've heard rumors about the base," she said, her tone low. "Some say it's overrun. Others say it's a trap. That the military is just using survivors to make more soldiers. I don't know if it's true, but it's not the safe haven everyone thinks it is." Jason's heart sank at the mention of the rumors. It was exactly what he had been afraid of, the possibility that the one place they'd been counting on might already be compromised. But he couldn't stop now. The base was their only option. He exchanged a look with Alex, who sat in the front seat, his face hard. Alex didn't speak immediately but finally nodded. "We'll take our chances," he said quietly. "We can't keep running. The base is our best bet." Jason couldn't help but agree, though the doubt still gnawed at him. The woman's warning echoed in his mind, but they had no choice but to push forward. As the miles passed, the tension in the truck only grew. It was as though the world outside was closing in on them, the landscape becoming more desolate and unforgiving. Jason's thoughts kept returning to the woman in the back. Who was she really? Could they trust her? She seemed honest enough, but in this world, appearances were deceiving. The woman seemed to sense the scrutiny on her. "I don't want trouble," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet desperation. "I just want to survive, like you. I don't know what happened to the world, but I don't want to die out here." Jason nodded, his gaze still focused on the road ahead. He had no reason to doubt her for now, but he would be watching her closely. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not again. The truck drove through a few small towns, their once bustling streets now empty and lifeless. Every building was either abandoned or wrecked, and every car they passed was a shell of what it once had been. This place had been a thriving community, but it was now just another casualty of the apocalypse. Jason's thoughts were interrupted by a sound, something he hadn't heard in a while. The faint rumble of engines. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but the sound grew louder, clearer. Someone was following them. "Alex," Jason called out, his voice sharp. "Do you hear that?" Alex stiffened at the wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Yeah. I hear it." He slowed the truck, glancing at the others. "We need to find cover. Now." Jason's pulse quickened. The last thing they needed was to be caught out in the open by a group of survivors, or worse, another horde of zombies. Alex turned the truck sharply off the main road, heading down a narrow dirt path that led into a dense cluster of trees. They pulled off the road and into a small clearing, just as the sound of engines grew louder. Jason's eyes scanned the woods, his instincts telling him they were about to face something much worse than just the undead. "Stay quiet," Alex muttered. "If it's another group of survivors, we don't want to draw attention." The truck's engine cut off as they sat in the clearing, waiting. Jason held his breath, trying to hear anything beyond the rustling of the trees and the pounding of his own heart. The sound of the engines was unmistakable now. They were close, too close. It was a matter of seconds before whoever was following them would come into view. Jason's fingers tightened around the crowbar in his hand. Whatever happened next, they were ready for it. He only hoped they weren't about to make a deadly mistake. The truck sat motionless in the clearing, hidden by the dense trees. Every breath Jason took felt like it echoed in his chest, the silence around them only adding to the tension. His eyes scanned the woods nervously, watching the shadows shift. They had to stay silent. The faint sound of engines was growing louder by the second. Whoever was following them, whether it was a group of survivors, raiders, or something worse, was close. "We can't just sit here forever," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. She was perched in the truck bed, her gaze fixed on the trees. "What if they're not friendly? Jason's gaze flickered to her before he answered in a low voice, "We wait. We have to make sure we're not being tracked." The hum of the approaching vehicles was unmistakable now. It wasn't just one vehicle, it sounded like multiple engines, their growls echoing through the forest. Jason's mind raced. If they had stumbled into a group of hostile survivors, things could get violent in an instant. In this new world, trust was a currency in short supply, and the likelihood of encountering threats was always high. Mark shifted nervously in the back of the truck, his grip tight on the crowbar. "What do you think it is?" he asked, voice low. Jason shook his head, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel. "I don't know. But we'll know soon enough." As the minutes ticked by, the sound of the engines grew louder still. Jason's heart rate increased as he spotted a faint dust cloud in the distance, signaling the approach of a convoy. They had to make a decision, and fast. Should they try to avoid them altogether, or risk confronting them head-on? "Alex," Jason said, his voice urgent. "Do you think we can outrun them if we make a break for it?" Alex didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the road and the clearing around them. He seemed to be weighing the risks. "Maybe," he said after a moment, "but we won't get far before they catch up. And if they're hostile, running could make us an easy target." Jason turned to look at Sarah and Mark. "We're going to have to face them. We don't have enough time to outrun them, and they'll find us sooner or later. We've got to prepare for the worst." Sarah gave a sharp nod, though her face betrayed her fear. "We fight our way out if we have to," she said, voice strained but determined. Suddenly, the sound of the engines broke through the trees, and Jason saw them, a group of 4 vehicles, all military-looking, their tires kicking up dust as they made their way through the overgrown path. The vehicles weren't full of undead, but they weren't exactly peaceful either. Armed men and women hung from the sides of the trucks, their eyes scanning the surrounding area. It was clear they were survivors, but not the kind Jason was hoping for. Jason's grip tightened on the wheel. There was no going back now. He had to act fast. "Everyone, stay down," he whispered, motioning for the others to crouch. The truck was low enough that they could hide, but not for long. He could feel the weight of their situation pressing on him. They were trapped in the clearing with no easy way out. The convoy came to a halt just outside the clearing. Jason's heart pounded as he watched the vehicles slow to a stop, the sound of their engines quieting. Footsteps crunched on the gravel as the soldiers began to spread out. Jason's mind raced. There was no telling how these people would react, but if they were hostile, it wouldn't take much to set off a fight. The truck's door creaked open, and a man stepped out from one of the lead vehicles. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in military fatigues. His eyes swept the area, scanning the woods with practiced precision. He spoke sharply to the others in his group, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We need to search the area," he said. "There might be more survivors hiding around here. Secure the perimeter." Jason's breath caught in his throat. They couldn't let themselves be found. If these people were part of a raider group, they'd take what they wanted by force. Jason knew they had to move, and fast. "I'll distract them," Mark whispered, his voice low and urgent. "You guys make a run for it." Jason's eyes widened. "No. We stay together. We don't split up." Mark shook his head. "We don't have a choice. They'll be on us before we can make it out of here. I'll give you the time you need." Before Jason could argue, Mark had already jumped out of the truck, slipping into the underbrush without a sound. His figure disappeared into the shadows of the trees, and Jason's heart raced. "Damn it, Mark," Jason muttered under his breath. There was no time to debate. Mark had made his choice. Now, they had to act. "Let's move," Jason said, his voice firm. He didn't wait for a response, grabbing the door handle and stepping out of the truck. The others followed closely behind, their steps light but quick. Jason led the group toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees were thick and the underbrush provided some cover. The convoy was still too close, and the military personnel were too alert. They needed to put as much distance between themselves and the group as possible. They moved swiftly, barely making a sound as they crept through the woods. Jason kept his eyes on the convoy, praying they wouldn't be seen. His pulse raced as he moved deeper into the forest. Every step was a risk, every rustle in the leaves a potential death sentence. Just as they reached the edge of the trees, a shout rang out from behind them. "Hey! Stop right there!" The soldier's voice was sharp and commanding, but Jason didn't stop. He pushed forward, urging the others to run. They sprinted through the underbrush, the sound of footsteps and shouting following close behind. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed himself harder. The trees thinned out ahead, and for a moment, it looked like they might be able to break free. But just as they reached the clearing, a gunshot rang out, followed by the sound of footsteps catching up. "Go!" Jason shouted. "Get to the road." They burst into the open, and Jason risked a glance over his shoulder. The soldiers were getting closer, but the distance was enough. He saw Mark up ahead, crouched behind a fallen tree. It looked like he had managed to draw their attention away, giving them the chance to escape. The group ran faster now, the sound of pursuit growing louder. Jason could feel the pressure mounting, but he didn't stop. Not until they were safely away. They were out of the woods, but the fight was far from over. The convoy was still on their tail, and now, more than ever, they had to rely on each other to survive. "Keep moving!" Jason yelled, pushing them harder. There was no time to look back. Only forward. The chase through the woods had felt endless. Their legs burned with exhaustion, and every breath they took was labored, but they kept running. The sound of footsteps behind them had grown faint, but the soldiers were relentless. Jason's mind was racing. Their chances of escape were slim, but he refused to give up. Not when freedom was so close. The forest thinned, and the road they had been aiming for came into view. The long stretch of asphalt seemed to offer hope, but Jason knew better. No matter where they went, they were never truly safe. The group sprinted down the road, glancing over their shoulders at every step. Mark had rejoined them, having led the soldiers on a wild goose chase through the woods. Jason caught sight of him up ahead, his face grim but determined. They were making good time, but the soldiers were bound to catch up soon. They couldn't outrun them forever. "We need to find a place to hold up," Sarah gasped, her face pale with exhaustion. "There's no way we're going to outrun them much longer." Jason nodded, but his mind was already working. They had no choice but to find shelter, fast. His eyes scanned the horizon. To the left, an abandoned gas station loomed in the distance. The place was old and worn down, but it was better than running aimlessly on an open road. "Over there," Jason said, pointing to the gas station. "We'll make a stand there. It's our only shot." The group changed direction, heading toward the gas station at a sprint. The walls of the building were decaying, the windows shattered, but it still provided a semblance of shelter. They reached the station, and Jason motioned for everyone to enter through the back. The door creaked as they pushed it open, entering the dimly lit interior. The smell of stale gasoline and dust filled the air. Shelves once stocked with snacks and supplies were now empty, save for a few scattered remnants. "We don't have long," Jason said, his voice tense as he closed the door behind them. He quickly checked the windows, peeking out cautiously. The soldiers were still on their trail, but they had yet to spot the gas station. He hoped the building's dilapidated state would keep them hidden a little longer. Alex moved to a counter, pulling a rusted pipe from the shelf. "We need to fortify the entrance. If they find us, we'll have to fight our way out." Jason nodded. "Set up what you can. We'll make our last stand here if we have to." As they worked to barricade the doors, Sarah walked to the back, looking around the dim interior. "What if we don't make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason stopped what he was doing, turning to face her. Her eyes were filled with fear, the kind of fear that only came from facing the end of everything you once knew. He stepped closer, his voice firm. "We will," he said, his gaze hardening with determination. "I don't care what happens. We will survive this." Before she could respond, a sudden noise from outside froze them all. Footsteps. They had found them. "Get ready," Jason ordered, his heart pounding in his chest. The soldiers were closing in. There was no time to second-guess their plan. Alex took his position near the door, the makeshift weapon in hand. Mark and Sarah were near the windows, peering out to track the soldiers' movements. Jason stood near the back, his senses on high alert, his mind calculating the next steps. They didn't have much ammo, but they had to make every shot count. If they could take out enough of the soldiers, they might be able to get away. Minutes passed like hours, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder with each second. Jason held his breath, listening to the quiet shuffle of boots on gravel. It was a matter of seconds now. They had to act fast. The door to the gas station suddenly creaked open, and Jason's pulse spiked. They were here. "Stay low," he whispered urgently. "When they come through, take them out one by one. No mercy." The first soldier appeared at the doorway, his silhouette barely visible against the fading light of the day. His eyes scanned the room, unaware of the trap waiting for him. Jason's breath caught in his throat, and his grip on his weapon tightened. As the soldier stepped forward, Alex sprang into action, slamming the pipe into the soldier's head. The man crumpled to the ground in a heap, unconscious but alive. The group moved quickly, dragging him out of sight behind the counter. But it wouldn't be long before the others came pouring in. Jason knew they were running out of time. "More are coming," Mark said grimly, his voice tense. "We don't have much time." Jason nodded, his mind racing. They had one shot at this, and it had to count. He motioned for the others to get ready. The door burst open, and two more soldiers rushed in, guns raised. Without hesitation, Jason and the others opened fire, the deafening noise of the gunshots echoing in the cramped gas station. It was chaos. The first soldier dropped to the ground with a grunt, but the second fired back. Bullets ricocheted off the walls, shattering glass and sending fragments flying in all directions. Mark dove behind a shelf for cover, narrowly avoiding a spray of bullets. Jason moved quickly, using the shelves for cover as he advanced. One soldier down. Another on the ground. They were running out of ammo, but they were making it count. "We're almost there," Jason shouted, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The last soldier was cornered now, his gun raised in a last desperate attempt to fight back. But before he could pull the trigger, Sarah lunged forward, knocking the weapon from his hands. She shoved him to the ground, pinning him down. "Get him," Jason ordered. Alex moved in, tying up the soldier with a length of rope. They had to make sure he couldn't alert the rest of the group. Jason took a deep breath, his body trembling from the rush of adrenaline. They had survived. They had won the battle, but the war wasn't over. "Let's move," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos of the moment. "We still have to get out of here." The group moved quickly, grabbing whatever supplies they could. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The fight was over for now, but their fight for freedom was far from finished. As they stepped out of the gas station into the night, Jason looked to the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would keep moving. They would survive. They had to. And in that moment, Jason knew something for sure: whatever came next, they were ready.